to try to put the PowerPoint that we've got here online for you so that you can follow along. If he doesn't manage to do that, you're going to just have to Google image search as I go. Just pick a name and then pop that into Google. You'll find somebody. I'm sure it'll help you as we go along. I'm going to dive in. This evening, I want to offer some reflections on what I see as a valuable period of Anglican church history. Valuable because it's fascinating in its own right, because it's part of our story, but also because I believe it has something to teach us about how to live in our own time and circumstance. But let me say first, or let me be the first to say, there are holes in this argument. I'll try to point them out as we go along, maybe. This is not a finished thesis. I will not touch on everything that one could, and it is one perspective among many others available to choose from. I intend this to be exploratory, not definitive, no matter how definitive I end up sounding as we move along. It's also offered as a reflection not on something I believe we're not doing here at St. Margaret's or in many churches around our city, but as a way of paying attention to something that we are doing and ought not take for granted. So, those important qualifications in place, let me try to tell you what we're going to do. We're going to look at, to start with our current political situation, particularly the democratic instability we see in our neighbors to the south, and then spend some time talking about the impact social media appears to be having on our cultural climate. Then we're going to look at a very different time and place, though one where the politics seemed likewise increasingly polarized and dangerously so, Elizabethan England. We'll look at some of the major political opponents, what the settlement of the religious question looked like, and what it was intended to achieve. From there, I'd like to come back to talk more directly about what the church and other communities of our own time might be able to do to oppose these polarizing pressures, how we might learn from Elizabeth I, her counselors, and her people. And I told my husband Caleb that I would just give him a nod and say he suggested I title this lecture, Settle Down. No. I think I've got that here. Okay. Barbara F. Walter, not this Barbara Walters that you might have just thought of, but this. Oh, uh-oh. That's bad. Where's Graham? Graham, I'm going to need you to come press the computer buttons. Oh, got it. It worked. Okay. This Barbara F. Walter. She is the Rohr Professor of International Relations at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. She's also a journalist and has written for numerous publications, including the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Affairs. She is a scholar and an expert on civil wars. In her own words, she has interviewed members of Hamas in the West Bank, ex-Sinn Féin members in Northern Ireland. She has stared into Syria at the height of the Syrian civil war from the Golan Heights, and she was driving across Zimbabwe as the military planned its coup against Robert Mugabe. Walter began studying civil wars in 1990 at a time when there was very little data to work with. Within a few years, though, scholarly knowledge on the topic expanded, and rapidly so. Around the world, scholars like her began collecting lots of data about various aspects of various conflicts in order to do statistical analysis and make predictions about political stability and the likelihood of civil war. What has been shocking for Walter is that the warning signs of instability they have identified in other places are the very same signs she's begun to see over the last decade on her own American soil. Her recent book, How Civil Wars Start, is fascinating. It includes incredible, disturbing stories and accounts from the ways in which civil war has erupted around the world in even just the last 30 years. The key point that Walter is trying to draw attention to, though, is what she believes is a new and alarming political change in the United States. She makes her case this way. The Polity Project at the Center for Systemic Peace, which is a nonprofit that supports research and quantitative analysis on democracy and political violence, has compiled a major data set with a long historical time frame that aims to quantify a country's system of governance for statistical analysis. It uses a scale on which they give a nation what they call a polity score. The scale goes from -10, where we find autocracies, countries that offer citizens no role in choosing their leaders and allow those leaders to rule as much as they like. So North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain. To +10, democracies, countries where elections are free and fair, no social groups are systemically left out of the political process, major political parties are stable and built on mass national constituencies. Countries like Norway, Japan, Denmark, and Canada have a +10 rating. Most of us probably, before really thinking about it, assume that civil wars are most likely to break out in the lowest end of that spectrum, at around a -8 or a -10. But actually, according to Walter, one of the best predictors of whether a country will experience civil war is whether it is moving toward or away from democracy. Civil wars are far more likely to break out when a country begins to transition and is passing through this dangerous middle zone, -5 to +5. Civil wars break out where a group of people that has had their power and influence displaced begin to galvanize and organize in order to take it back. Countries almost never go from a full autocracy to a full democracy without a very rocky transition in that middle zone in between. Some experts call that middle zone anocracies. They're neither full autocracies nor democracies. Citizens have some elements of democratic rule, maybe even full voting rights, but they also live under leaders with extensive authoritarian powers and little or no checks and balances. What's alarming for Walter is that over the last 6 years, the United States has been given its lowest polity score in this system since the year 1800. The system hasn't lasted for that long, but they just give it a score all the way back. After the election in 2016, America fell to a +8. The four major factors the Polity Project uses to assess democracy are how free elections are from government control, how constrained the executive branch is, how open and institutionalized political participation is, and how competitive the recruitment for the presidency is. International observers deemed the 2016 election to be free but not entirely fair. They saw that election rules had been changed as a result of partisan interests, and this affected the outcome and America's polity score. Then in 2019, when President Trump refused to cooperate with Congress during its impeachment inquiry, America's score dropped to a +7. And then on January 6th of last year, and the brief occupation of the Capitol building by supporters of Donald Trump, America's polity score dropped, according to Walter, to a +5. Walter isn't saying that civil war is about to break out in the United States at any moment. She's not even saying that it is definitely going to break out. Her argument, and it's hers, not mine, is simply that this is something to pay attention to, that the United States is no longer in the peerage of democratic nations like Canada, Japan, and Denmark. That alone, according to Walter, is a significant change that we should be paying attention to. Of course, Canada is not the United States. We do not have the same system of government, and we can and should be thankful for our present stability. No one is saying Canada's governance, or at least I'm not saying Canada's governance is not without its own grave errors, just that in general, we do enjoy a level of confidence in our governance system that we should not take for granted. In particular, we should not take this for granted because some of the factors that have contributed to this shift in stability in the United States, at least according to Walter and many of her colleagues in the field, also affect Canadians. The biggest one is the dynamic effect of social media. Now, as a starting place for talking about social media and its effects on our political system, I want to address anyone here that's over 30 who might be thinking to themselves, as I have once before, yes, the problem is the young people and their darn social media with their Facebooks and their TikToks and their Instagrams. As we'll see, no demographic is necessarily immune to the adverse effects of social media. But what I have realized that we cannot do is point the finger at young adults who did not build this world of social media, but were dropped into it. They were born into it. High school graduates this year were born in the same year that Facebook was created. Young adults today are those who have had to grow up within this world. And what many of them use it for, what they've figured out to do with it, is to be creative. We might think it's sort of cringy or ironic, but a bunch of them are making videos that are genuinely funny and last about 20 seconds. Now, I don't know we don't know if this is gonna work. And if you've never seen a TikTok, it's hilarious to me that I will be the person to introduce it to you. This is 40 seconds. You're not gonna get these 40 seconds of your life back, but hopefully they'll be memorable. Okay, Colton thinks this will work for sound. Uh-oh.
Hello again. So here we all are for the 6th time, and it's so nice to look out there and see so many familiar heads, faces. When Henry first came to me and said he'd fallen in love with Catherine, sorry, Anne. Sorry, Jane. Sorry, Anne. Sorry, Catherine. The other Catherine. Come on, mate.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for indulging me in that. I think these little videos are a way of briefly checking out from a world otherwise very full of very bad news and too much of it all at once. I'm not saying it's universally good. I'm just saying there's a project involved there in trying to communicate something in 43 seconds. Yes, there are well-founded concerns about the attention span issues that some of these platforms can cause, not to mention the data harvesting by foreign powers. My point, just for the moment though, is that it is creative. They have figured out a creative thing to do with it. And actually, lots of them are making real things in the world, often things they watched their grandparents make or heard their grandparents talk about, clothing, food, metalworks, and using social media to directly connect with their customers, even local customers. This is a clothing manufacturer that operates out of Winnipeg, right there on McDermott Avenue. This is a food-making person who also operates out of Winnipeg and makes delicious, delicious food. And who doesn't want to look at that every day, right? That's her Instagram page. What young people are trying to do or find the ways that social media is constructive. They're trying to find its redemptive forms, and arguably, especially with respect to communicating about things they're creating, they're finding those forms. So those of us who are older just might think once in a while of commending young people today a little more often for living with pressures that most of us don't really see and have not spent our lives managing. All that said, does not mean that young people are immune to the adverse effects of social media, particularly with respect to the political polarization we are seeing not only in the United States, but in Canada and other stable democracies as well. Barbara F. Walter refers to social media as the accelerant. Over the last 10 years, she argues, more countries have moved down that scale from democracies, and social media has been directly linked to increased civil unrest around the world. For instance, as social media penetrated countries in Africa and gained a larger share of people's attention, a clear pattern emerged. Ethnic factions grew, social divisions widened, resentment at immigrants increased, bullying populists got elected to public office, and violence began to increase. Open, unregulated social media platforms turned out to be the perfect accelerant for the conditions that lead to civil war, writes Walter. The problem isn't the people using the social media. The problem is social media's business model. They make money by keeping you engaged in their platform for as long as possible. The longer you stay on their platform, the more advertising revenues they receive. And so it allows companies to gather, it also allows companies to gather more behavioral data about its users. In 2009, Facebook introduced the like button. And that very same year, it introduced an algorithm that used your previous likes to determine the posts that you would see. Google, which owns YouTube, soon followed. And it turns out, shockingly, that what people like, literally, most is fear over calm, and often falsehood over truth. Studies have shown since that information that keeps people engaged is exactly the type of information that drives toward anger, resentment, and violence. As a former ethicist for Google explained in 2019, in a New York Times article in 2019, if I'm YouTube, this is a direct quote, if I'm YouTube and I want you to watch more, I am always going to steer you toward Crazy Town, end quote. In preparation for this talk, I watched several flat earth videos on YouTube, and I can tell you they truly are engaging. It is hard to look away, I would say. The behavioral algorithms that these platforms use begin creating self-reinforcing, increasingly outlandish information silos that lead users down dangerous paths, while giving you the impression that they're not, because you are clicking on the link, which feels a lot like agency. One computer scientist at Sapienza University di Roma analyzed 54 million comments over 4 years in different Facebook groups and found that the longer a conversation continued, the more extreme the comments became. It is that business model of engagement that makes social media so terrifying to scholars who study civil wars. The model, currently at least, doesn't care if the information it disseminates is true or not. It only cares that it's absorbing. It isn't that social media alone drives countries down the democratic ladder. It's the way that they can heighten the ethnic, social, religious, and geographic divisions that are already the first step in the creation of factions. Because myth, emotion, and the politics of grievance, all of which drive factionalism, make for incredibly engaging content. Even more, by promoting a sense of perpetual crisis, algorithms give rise to this growing sense of despair and convinces citizens that counterattacks by their opposition groups are very likely. It creates a sense, often a false sense, that moderates, even within their own movement, are not doing enough to protect the population or are weak compared to their opposition. Violence then breaks out when citizens become so convinced that there is no hope of fixing problems through conventional means. And we haven't even begun to mention the emotional effects of heavy social media use and its links to mental ill health, especially in youth. In 2019, a study from the University of Montreal, researchers looked at survey data from 4,000 teens over 4 years and found far higher levels of depression symptoms, hopelessness, sadness, suicidal thoughts, the more participants use social media, because of the consistent exposure to unrealistic life standards and the fear of constant judgment. Part of the problem with social media, it seems, is that we are constantly making windows into our own souls, putting on display the best and the worst of ourselves, and then looking into others, and that is making us sick. We want to think about social media as a benign communication tool, but it isn't. It is driven by profits. It turns the consumer into a product, and it can exploit our absolute worst impulses with dramatic and very real political consequences, not to mention the emotional consequences. That is true of Facebook, it's true of Twitter, it's true of TikTok, it's true of Instagram. But that is where we're going to leave our present circumstance and go back to a time when people got news by writing letters to one another and putting them on horseback and sending them across the country. Not just for nostalgia's sake. We're going to spend some time now trying to do as C.S. Lewis suggested and let the sea breeze of the centuries blow through our minds and take a close look at Elizabethan England, specifically the Elizabethan settlement, the religious compromise that aimed at providing the framework in which a polarized public found unity. Now, I'm sure that many of you here tonight are well familiar with Tudor church history, but because there might just be one or two of you here tonight quietly wondering which Elizabeth I mean, I'm going to fill in the gaps on some of the historical background. At the outset, though, it's worth it to say this. Elizabeth I is who we're talking about. She lived in the 1500s. She is not a universally loved or even respected figure. seems to me there are two main views on Elizabeth. First, that she was an awful tyrant. She was an egomaniac like her father. She betrayed the best interests of people for her own agenda. And she even betrayed her own womanness by effectively becoming a man. This is sort of the subtle suggestion in the 2018 film Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary is the good, true queen. Elizabeth has become one of the men with power, not a queen, but a king. This view holds that she was of suspect personal morality, wooing foreign princes but not marrying, carrying on with her personal confidant Dudley, who was possibly implicated in the suspicious death of his wife. On this view, further, the settlement was just a new iteration of a deeply repressive regime, arguably all the worse for the way it has been celebrated as more tolerant than the arrangement under her sister Mary. So the sorrow and injustice of it has really just been papered over. Or even worse, given the actual lived experience of diversity, parish by parish, in the midst of the settlement, she didn't even accomplish her aim of uniformity. It was only ever skin deep and maybe not even. So that's all one view. One is free to take. My view, however, is that she was a capable leader who ruled as a middle child. Are there any middle children here tonight? Yeah, this is for you. Okay. She was the middle child of Henry VIII. The youngest was Edward, the oldest was Mary, and they had both been fairly disastrous. Elizabeth was practiced at making duty her priority, in holding off on tipping her hand, not to be duplicitous, but in order to survive. She was used to living in the midst of a dysfunctional family, and she had learned not only how to cope, but how to maintain the power to make others patient. And arguably, it was because she was a woman surrounded by very powerful men that she was forced to work more carefully and considerately with Parliament. She had to, especially at the outset of her reign, win the confidence of the people while outmaneuvering all those who were actively trying to remove her from the throne. Far from betraying her femininity, I think she demonstrated the impressive ingenuity and resilience and capacity that she had learned by being a woman in the Tudor court. As we'll see, what she aimed at in governance was civility, a way to live together without killing each other, quite literally. And she saw the church as the best possible means to achieve that end. What she managed to do, on this view, was extraordinary. She did not let her country devolve and return back to yet another violent swing of the pendulum. They were at least preserved from having blood on their own hands. They were saved from civil war for the time being. Dermot McCulloch, the historian, says of Elizabeth and her like-minded counselors, quote, "They knew the specialized heroism of making choices about concealing opinions and compromising in dangerous times, rather than the luxury of proclaiming their convictions in unsullied purity," end quote. This doesn't mean she wasn't without her faults. It doesn't mean she was perfect. It does mean she is a fair focus of our admiration and tonight, our respect. So, for some historical background, excuse me. I should have prefaced that TikTok video. I don't know if you guys caught, but that guy was pretending to be Henry VIII's best man. We got that? Okay, good. Because it was thematic. I just wanted to make sure you all caught that. Elizabeth I was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Henry VIII was the king in whose reign the Reformation of the Church in England began. Because Henry was so infatuated with Anne Boleyn, who was of Protestant leaning, he sought to be divorced from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who was Catholic. He was also terrified that he had transgressed the laws of God by marrying his late brother's wife, Catherine, which was why he had no male heir. With the help of some key counselors, particularly Thomas Cromwell, who you might recognize from the Hilary Mantel Booker Prize-winning novels, as well as Thomas Cranmer, He succeeded not in getting the Pope's permission to divorce Catherine, who also happened to be the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor at the moment, but in making the case that he and not the Pope, oh, where did he go? Henry should be the supreme head of the church in England, and thus could have his marriage to Catherine annulled on the grounds that it was unlawful in the first place, and then marry Anne Boleyn. There was trouble, though. For one thing, Anne did not bear Harry a son. She did have a daughter, and that was Elizabeth. But when Elizabeth was 3, Anne was charged with very likely false charges of adultery, and she was executed, which meant that Elizabeth, like the daughter of Catherine, Mary, was declared a bastard, was effectively a problem, just a state problem. Now let's fast forward again a little bit. Henry eventually did have a male heir with Jane Seymour, Edward Seymour. He became king when he was a boy. He was the first English monarch to have been raised a Protestant, and under him, the Reformation in England was able to be carried much further than it had been under Henry VIII, his father. But his reign was cut short when he died of illness in 1553, at which time Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary, unfortunate title, but Mary I, who was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, a devoted Catholic, became queen. Mary was best known for her rigorous determination to undo the English Reformation and restore the old religion to England. During her 5-year reign, 5 years, over 280 religious dissenters were burned at the stake, including Thomas Cranmer. During that time, also, Elizabeth lived a very precarious existence. She was accused frequently, yet protested her innocence constantly, of plotting against her sister to usurp the crown. Mary died in 1558, and Elizabeth I became queen. Before her laid a task of extreme difficulty and danger. Years of tyranny, brutality, and unsuccessful foreign policy had produced much dissatisfaction in the country. Plus, England's first experience of a woman on the throne had not given much confidence to the idea that a woman could be a monarch at all. John Knox, the Presbyterian leader, vocally objected to the monstrous regiment of women, which did not, surprisingly, endear John Knox to Elizabeth I. Now, there were 3 groups when Elizabeth inherited the country, that the country was basically divided into. The first was Catholics. Included in this group were all the bishops, because those who had objected to Mary's return of the church to Rome had been tossed out or fled in exile. The Catholics were those who were committed to the old religion, the Catholic tradition. Many Protestant historians and theologians since the Reformation have tended to caricature the Catholic faith as sort of decrepit and worn out and dead, not meeting the needs of the people. But that really is a caricature. Largely, churches were meeting the needs of the people because, just by way of a major oversimplification, they were quite simply religious, and this was their religious tradition. Dermot McCullough makes an interesting point and tells the story of Holy Spirit's Festival of Whitsuntide in a Bavarian diocese. This diocese is not the real church, but this is the real place. So at Pentecost, a carved wooden dove was lowered down on the congregation through a hole in the ceiling, and then the dove was closely followed with a big bucket of water. And wherever the dove landed, there's a point, I really will get to it, but wherever the dove landed, you would get splashed with water, and whoever was the wettest at the end of the ceremony got to be the person that flew the dove around the next year. The point is that that kind of liturgical innovation is proof of a huge stability in the old religion. The apparent irreverence was itself a symptom of how strongly the vast majority of people felt faith in the system and how much they could relax in it. Now, that story comes from Bavaria, but the argument is that was probably also true of Catholics in England. They weren't sitting in fusty old churches like gee whiz wishing somebody would come and save them. They were having a good time. It was the church they wanted to be in. So that's the Catholics. They're not like sad people that don't actually care about their faith or about their churches at all, quite the opposite. The second major group were those who had been captured by Reformed principles. We think of them as Protestants. From within this group will emerge those who came to be called the Puritans, but They called themselves Gospelers. This group included many of those who had become exiles during the reign of Mary I. They fled to Protestant strongholds on the continent, especially Geneva, where they studied with other disciples of the Reformation and teachers of the Reformation. They came back with Elizabeth's accession, ready to press for further reform. They wanted to see the Church of England look much more like the Protestant churches of the Low Countries in Europe, particularly the Reformed churches, and they wanted to have absolutely nothing to do with Rome or with any of its customs. Now, it's worth noting that these first two groups in particular, so this Protestant group and the Catholic groups, truly believed one another to be absolutely and completely wrong about the central dimension of human life. They didn't just happen to disagree about what kind of church they should go to. They are not living in a time of religious tolerance where there's lots of denominations to choose from, like we do. When you sat them down and you said, what is the most fundamental thing to get right about human life, they would have said religion, and they would have answered the question about what that looks like completely differently. So in other words, there's a fair amount of animosity between these two groups. The third group, though, was a sort of middling group. They were satisfied fully neither with Rome nor Geneva, and they were proponents of a moderate reform. It's kind of hard to say where the boundaries of that middle group are because there were moderates sort of a Catholic leaning and moderates of a Protestant leaning. But that's sort of the third group. Now, it's again important to remember that the country had just been tossed back and forth in terms of official religion based on the personal preference and devotion of the monarch. Each of the first two of Henry's heirs, so Edward and Mary there, had made violent swings in the life of the nation, away from Rome, back to Rome, and now it was the ball was back in Elizabeth's court. Caution for her was essential. She would not be hustled to show her hand. She selected very capable counselor in William Cecil, a moderate reformer, to be her principal secretary, and he would serve her until his death in 1598. She also had a lucky find in Matthew Parker and appointed him to be the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1559. He was also a reformer. J.H.R. Mormon, the Anglican historian, called Parker, or said of him, he was a particularly good scholar and a man of courage and vision. He was not afraid to stand up to the Queen when he disagreed with her policies. For instance, she was deeply committed to a celibate clergy, and he was not. And he had a clear idea of what he wanted the Church of England to be. He wanted it to be based on true scholarship, drawing on the best of the traditions of the early church. He wanted it to be faithful to Scripture, honest, and dignified. It is to him, perhaps more than to anyone else, that we owe the type of churchmanship which we associate with Anglicanism, says Mormon. Elizabeth herself refused certain Catholic ceremonies in her chapel. One Christmas, she walked out on Mass because the bishop raised the host, but she also kept a crucifix in her chapel, much to the chagrin of reformers around her. And honestly, it seemed like she just kept the crucifix in there just to bug them, just to make sure they were also being bugged. All of those idiosyncrasies sort of subtly belied her sympathies, it seems. Now, the Elizabethan settlement, irrelevant slide. The Elizabethan settlement refers to the settling of the religious question, which was something that was technically or legally achieved by Elizabeth's first Parliament of 1559. The Parliament passed two very important acts for the Church. First was the Act of Supremacy. This revived Henry VIII's legislation against Rome. It abolished the jurisdiction of foreign powers, and it imposed an oath of supremacy on all ecclesiastical and lay officials, acknowledging Elizabeth as supreme governor. Now, that title is actually a notable shift from the language of supreme head, as Henry, her father, was named. Likely, the shift was a deliberate means of distinguishing between two types of authority in the church. As Oliver O'Donovan identifies them, the authority to command versus the authority to convince. It seems that Elizabeth elected to identify herself as the supreme governor so as to give no indication that she saw herself as adopting priestly powers. As O'Donovan points out, the monarch has the power to command, but not to convince. No monarch, no matter how beloved, can convince the hearts and minds of the people that the gospel is the truth. For that, we are all dependent on the prophetic word and the gracious sacraments. Elizabeth's job as supreme governor was to provide the opportunity for her people to come into contact with that convincing power. Now, it's important at this point, and the reason I draw that distinction out, is to recognize the principles of an Anglican view of authority at work in this act, and this moment in the Reformation of the Church in England, really. These principles merit a fuller theological examination, which will have to be in another lecture. For tonight, I'd like to focus just on how this act did not just establish the headship of the English Church as distinct from Rome, it established that there was a ruler who maintained a singular authority over the Church. The Parliament granted Elizabeth the power, the authority, and the responsibility to see the bigger picture. The Parliament and the Act sees authority as rooted in a particular responsibility to be the keeper of a wise and patient pragmatism. Her supremacy was determined by her responsibility to chart a way forward through the details. Some of those details she would get right, some she might get wrong. The point was that her hand wasn't just on the tiller, her hand was the tiller. The people were going with her. There could be argument, there would be debate, there would be studying and discovering, and ultimately, someone would need to make a decision for good or ill, and that would be her. There you go. Ultimately, the act reopened the breach with Rome, and it basically forced almost all the bishops to be deprived of their offices and even imprisoned when they wouldn't sign the oath of supremacy. So when they wouldn't agree that Elizabeth was the supreme governor of the church. One bishop that remained from Marion's time, Bishop Kitchen, did sign the oath, sort of throwing his lot in with the new regime, but that was just one of the 9 that were left. There's some evidence that this act was as far as Elizabeth herself wanted to go in this reform. But there was pressure from a group of London reformers that meant Parliament went on to pass the second act, the Act of Uniformity. This act was rooted in the country's need for strength through unity, so it reintroduced the prayer book, now the prayer book of 1559, which was a conservative revision of the prayer book of 1552 under Edward, with slight alterations to make it somewhat less Protestant. For instance, the Black Rubric, which was a bit of slightly vitriolic, or quite seriously vitriolic instruction against kneeling at communion. The Black Rubric referred to people that knelt at communion as a means of adoring the host as depraved and ignorant. So they took that rubric out, just as a signal to the Catholics that maybe they could still come to church here. Another example is that the words of administration of the 1549 prayer book were joined with those of the 1552 prayer book, which is what we say now on Sunday mornings. So I'm not going to repeat it. You can find out on Sunday when you come back to church for communion. And it also included, the Act of Uniformity also included the insertion of an ornaments rubric, which included the restoration of Eucharistic vestments. Now, on vestments, the historian and theologian Stephen Neal writes, we might have thought that sensible men and women would not engage in violent controversy over things so indifferent as a piece of linen. But he writes, a flag is only a square of cloth. But if it has come to be the symbol of the pride and dignity of a great country, what it signifies bears very little relation to the stuff of which it is made. So the wearing or the not wearing of a few yards of white linen can present itself as a matter on which the fate of empires and churches may depend. Which is another way of saying these things really mattered to the people. It mattered that the ornaments rubric was put back into the prayer book. They were things that people didn't just feel mixed feelings about, they felt very deep, serious feelings about. This act was also followed by royal injunctions that included new clauses about clerical dress, encouraging kneeling at prayers, bowing at the name of Jesus, and one injunction outlawing preaching for a while, and then rules on teaching for catechism. Effectively, the Act of Uniformity determined that this was how the church in England was going to look. This is what we were doing. There were, however, strict penalties for the recusants and those that did not comply, and we'll come back to those penalties shortly. First, though, I just want to take some time to look at what the settlement in England looked like in practice. We've just talked about how it occurred legally. What did it actually look like sort of on the ground? Because what's interesting is that despite the Act of Uniformity, the picture that we get of church life in the Elizabethan age is actually one of diversity. Most clergy just sort of got on with it. They got the prayer books, they said the prayers as they were printed, they carried on. But many of the objections tended to come from the laity. At one extreme, you would have Catholics and Marian clergy who paid lip service to the Act of Uniformity, but they preferred and then kept the old ways. So they would go and say their morning prayer in the Book of Common Prayer, and then they would go off to some little chapel and receive the Mass properly. At the other extreme were Puritans who displayed the prayer book, but then sort of introduced customs contrary to the Act of Uniformity. Between those two poles, extremes, there were people of all shades of opinions, and what went on in parishes depended on the opinions and tastes of the clergy. So even loyalty to the prayer book allowed for a good deal of variety, then as now. Additions could be made, rubrics could be interpreted in all kinds of ways. At least early on in her reign, Elizabeth was prepared to sort of wink at a certain amount of resistance to conformity, especially in the north where there were all these little pockets of recusants, some who outwardly conformed while continuing to receive Catholic Mass privately, as I've just said, which probably is what Elizabeth seems to have done when Mary I was on the throne. And that may have been what gave her more patience than some reformers would have liked. Additionally, apart from actual outright disobedience or lawlessness, church life was at a fairly low ebb in the early part of her reign, but it steadily gained momentum over time. Churches that had been destroyed in Henry VIII's reign and in Mary's reign and in Edward's reign all began to be restored and refurnished. Clergy started to show increasing signs of responsibility and capability. The Elizabethan bishops, because the ones that had been around under Mary had all been imprisoned or lost their jobs, all the Elizabethan bishops had been appointed by the Queen, and therefore they were all more or less in agreement with the kind of uniformity program. Nobody that didn't agree, no recusant, could hold office, and most of the very keen Protestants refused to because they didn't accept or agree with the project in the first place. So parish by parish, the Eucharist was celebrated generally about once a month at the end of morning prayer, but again with a fair bit of variety about it. Even in those pockets where the old customs lingered on, where the bells kept ringing and the prayers for the departed were said, still the Reformation left its mark on the character of worship in churches in particular. Even despite opposition to Puritans, a strong movement to more subjective, or what they saw as subjective worship associated with Puritanism, like a greater focus on reading the Bible and preaching, came to be seen. Also, the Elizabethan age was deeply interested in education and educational facilities that were provided to the sons of squires and merchants. Old grammar schools continued and new schools were founded more and more. Parish churches that had been treated fairly roughly during the middle years of the 16th century continued at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, and many managed to keep lots of their treasures. One significant difference between the Reformation in England and on the continent, according to Dermot McCulloch, was the preservation and survival of cathedrals and collegiate churches with good choirs. This allowed for a much greater patronage of the arts. It saw development of the metrical psalms, which were provided tunes by the likes of Thomas Tallis. Elizabeth was such a fan of choral music, the period saw great outbursts of beauty in literature and in music, especially marking the latter period of Elizabeth's reign. Among the large company of esteemed artists are William Byrd, Orlando Gibbons, Thomas Morley. But here, let's come back to this question about what the cost of the uniformity was and what the uniformity of the settlement was really aimed at. It might be hard for us to imagine being on the side of strict penalties for not attending church services on Sundays. If you didn't attend, there was a fine. The fine was either it was sort of in the range of a full day's wage to 3 days' wages, depending on your employment for most of the laity. If you continued in non-compliance, that could lead to imprisonment, even life imprisonment. And later in her reign, Catholics were very brutally persecuted under Elizabeth, but we're not really going to get into that tonight. The thing about the harsh penalties, though, are that really they point to the seriousness of what they were trying to achieve. The penalties describe how high they thought the stakes were. Elizabeth and her counselors really believed that in order to be a nation of polarized factions, a nation of people who thought very differently from one another, they needed to achieve at least some basic form of unity. They needed some structure to do that within. So it might be helpful to sort of put that in terms of our own culture or terms that we might be able to recognize. So in a secular culture like our own, we have our own ways of sort of exerting a coercive pressure to enact social cohesion, social order. For example, we all, I would imagine, largely agree that there ought to be penalties for people who don't pay their taxes. It costs a lot to have roads and libraries and schools. We all agree we should pitch in to the extent that we have the income to be able to do so. We elect a government to decide how much to or how to split up the bill. And then if somebody just refuses to pay their part, we, I think, mostly agree that there should be some kind of consequence for that. Well, in a religious society like Elizabethan England, it makes sense that the forms of coercion would be religious. The penalty on not attending church wasn't meant to make going to church a kind of tax. It was meant to articulate how seriously and significant the Queen and her counselors took church. But even more, the settlement wasn't aimed at uniformity of thought. It was aimed just at outward uniformity, so that one was free to have one's own inner thoughts and beliefs and preferences. Elizabeth was not trying to make windows into men's souls. The settlement provided the people of England with something that was good for them, a church where people forged a unity not of similarity, but familiarity. The point wasn't that they had to all think alike. The point was that by saying their prayers together, by hearing the scriptures together, they would be formed together. Formed not just by having the right opinions or beliefs, formed in wisdom. They were being formed in the ability to live in peace with patience. Yes, it would eventually devolve into civil war. 40 years after Elizabeth I's death, neighbors would turn on neighbors. But once that conflict passed, once the dust settled and the order was restored, it was restored in the Elizabethan pattern, as though a familiar wisdom really was to be found there. The Puritans did not like everything about it. Lots of them didn't like anything about it. The Catholics perhaps liked even less about it. But while the extremes clamored about getting all of the details right, the group in the middle got on with the tougher work of living together. And in the end, they forged actually a new thing. Here is a warning. I'm about to be I'm going to shamelessly wax poetic now for a moment about why Anglicans are so great. The middle group made this new, distinct thing. They found a way to be a new sort of Christian, a Christian who is conscious of their ancient roots and willing to look to a new horizon. They were joined, they found, by being both Catholic and Reformed. Now, by way of some concluding remarks, I just want to try to draw out some of the similarities between Elizabethan England and our own time with the help of Rowan Williams. In 2019, Williams gave a lecture at Australian Catholic University entitled "Overcoming Political Tribalism." Now, he points out that tribalism already, the word tribalism, already tells a story about a time when one culture designated others as sort of subhuman and in need of civilizing. He points out further that modernity's own tendency to dismiss the past is itself a form of tribalism. We have inherited an Enlightenment sense of progress, of things moving in a definite and good direction, which means, therefore, that the past has nothing to teach us. Which, if you didn't pick up, I think is wrong, right? That's not good. In Williams' view, our current political tribalism is rooted in particular in two issues. First, it is a byproduct of rationalism. It takes for granted that we don't need to describe the process of learning. We don't need to describe the labor and negotiations and difficulty and confusions by which we arrive at moral and political perspectives. I think today this is also related to the tendency that social media has to point people to conclusions and not to arguments. This leads to a shrinkage of the scope of mutual recognition. Williams writes, "I resolve not to think of the other's view as sharing any of the moral anxieties or emotional tensions that I experience." So someone who supports assisted dying will characterize the principled opponent as emotionally deaf to unmanageable suffering. Or the pro-life advocate will characterize the doctor who performs the procedure of abortion as a murderer. Or the critic of an Israeli government is an anti-Semite, and the critic of anti-Semitism has been duped by some Zionist conspirator. A green activist is somehow unmoved by the impoverishment of workers. It's a kind of shrinkage of scope that we start to slip into. What I believe the church can do and be is a space where we recognize the need for and the real process of learning and learning together, where people who are different, who think differently, can nevertheless find a space in which they might start to grasp the history and structure of the investment of the stranger, the other, where we might even try to discover what is recognizable in the other. In Elizabeth's England, this meant being engaged in the same act of worship, in the reading of the scriptures, the breaking of bread, and the prayers. It was this that made them a recognizable people to one another and created the space and time for learning. Elizabeth was infuriatingly slow in the view of most Puritans and infuriatingly stubborn in the view of most Catholics. But both seem, in my view, to have amounted to a kind of pragmatic wisdom. The point of creating this space isn't to relativize our commitments. It is to be affected by the unity of familiarity. That is, the point isn't to weaken our commitments. It is to try to discover what the grammar of another's moral energy has in common with one's own. That makes it harder to see a conflict in terms of absolute victory or defeat. Williams writes, "To recognize a credible moral perspective in the program of a successful majority allows a minority to see where the argument can continue. To recognize that an unsuccessful minority holds views with at least some roots in common with those of the winners is to find a rationale for accommodating that minority." To achieve something like that kind of awareness, today, just as in Elizabethan England, we need to nurture practices, communities, organizations that allow for an attentive social imagination to come to fruition. We need places where we can learn to pay attention to the stories and priorities that are not native to us. That means we need to build environments, create settings in which there is enough trust for those things to be really articulated. This is another way of saying we need to create communities on the ground that are not being driven by engagement algorithms, but are real, honest desires. This is something the church can and must do, and Anglicans actually have a history of figuring out just how to do this. I believe it takes courage to pray alongside people you do not understand, and it just may be one of the most prudent things we can do in and for our wider communities. One of the things the Elizabethan settlement church aimed at, really, was identifying that there are forms of human solidarity and exchange that do not depend on identifying enemies. They were united, even though they disagreed, because they prayed together. To belong to a community that is trying to hold on to a strong center Trying to resist social pressures to extremism is not to be apolitical. It is deeply and entirely political. To discover or rediscover this kind of solidarity, this sort that finds time for mutual listening, according to Williams, is probably the most significant preservative for law-governed democracy in our contemporary societies, both because it creates a context in which what we owe to one another is learned in the time it takes to build a durable level of trust, and because it maintains a space for learning and keeping fundamental argument alive. Thus, the church must continue to be and become a place where we do not make windows into one another's souls, but endeavor to discover doorways into the hidden corners of our own, doorways to new practices of patience and prudence, but also compassion and Christian unity here and now. Thank you. Keeping in mind all those qualifications, that I started with earlier about this not being a finished thesis and there being holes in the argument and all those things, any questions or comments? Landon?
With the way you kind of ended there, I kept on thinking of what has recently happened in Germany with the Reichsbürger. And a lot of the very public calls for these extremists to be rooted out of elected positions and security apparatus of the nation. And how do you make space for such a alienated extremist group in the midst of the nation?
Yeah.
Not to answer that.
No.
You don't have an answer for that.
I don't have an answer for, I certainly don't.
I think you're touching on,
Yeah.
we need these spaces up and running. Like we can't kind of just expect them to find a space for that.
No, that's right. I think that is exactly right. That the point that I'm trying to make is that these communities, real communities, right? Real communities of mutual listening do exist. They exist in cities all over the world. They need to not be taken for granted by the people that are part of them in order to resist that kind of polarizing pressure, for one thing, right? And be robust enough to actually respond to extremists. So part of what I think we are seeing in Germany and Sweden also are, again, it relates in my mind back to the way that social media gives extremists a direct avenue to citizens, right? So the Sweden Democrats, I think, is the party name of a once neo-Nazi party, right? That's now the second, I think it's the second largest party in the, I think that's right. Somebody can Google that later. But one of the ways they weren't, when the leader of that party was trying to sort of rebrand the party, the radio stations, national radio stations, newspapers wouldn't run their ads. They were having a hard time gaining a following. Social, like Facebook, enter Facebook, bingo, they had direct access to a huge section of the citizenship, right? So I guess like in a really like dramatically oversimplified way, I would say switch the old Facebook off and come to church. Yeah. Sorry, you had another question, I think?
Oh, it was just a comment.
Oh, great.
My appreciation of it is that
Oh, yeah, settle down. Yeah, that's right. One for Caleb, yeah. I'll pass that on. He already knows that that's the better title, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I guess that the picture we have of those three king and two queens who were all going to the same family, and we had very little on the ground, it seems well. That also can be a picture of our own families, which is probably one of the hardest places to find, because there's no space there.
Mm-hmm.
Here. And it's one of the most important places where this needs to happen.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. Again, I would say the church can perhaps afford even families a type of space that you can't get in your own house, right? Yeah. Go to different churches, for example. Nathan?
Yeah, so my sense of what you're getting at is that we should take inspiration from the Elizabethan settlements and kind of apply it to communities, contemporary communities today, like the church. Take that point. No, it seems to be.
Oh yeah, sorry, no, that was my agreeing face. Yep. I was just hearing I'm bracing. That's my bracing myself face. Yes.
Okay, but to me, like what made the Elizabethan settlement really work, really click, was that it was compulsory, right? Like you paid a fine if you did not attend this format. And so I mean, maybe that is actually what you want. I don't dispute it.
I don't hate it, but
You know, if you are not interested in making it compulsory today, I guess my question is, like, how does it work? Like, of course, there will be people who show up to like Elizabethan settlement, like environments, but it seems to me that those are kind of the people you don't need to reach out to. Like, they don't, you know, if you're like, okay, I really want to get the mutual listening, you're probably not on either of the extremes of the tribes. So then, like, how do you kind of make that effective to the people who really want to get involved?
well, I think that the desire to be part of, I don't mean that we should recreate. I mean, we kind of already are living in any Anglican church that uses the Book of Common Prayer has already sort of received something from the Elizabethan settlement, right, and using it. But I think that the way that people get sort of, like, I think anybody that has grown tired of the feeling of a kind of tribal politics in a way, right? Like where there are different camps and you spend all of your time talking about enemies and not opponents, right? Like once we get tired enough of that, I think we start going and looking for places where we can find human beings that we can actually talk with, right? And I think, I don't know if I'm getting exactly at the answer to your question or an answer to your question, but I think that that kind of, like the sort of like tiresome load that is our current political moment, right, is what is already sort of pressing people just to look for different forms of community. And I shouldn't say it only can happen in religious communities, right? There's lots of ways to sort of discover a common investment with your neighbor, right? Like a parent organization at a school or a credit union or a sports team, right? Or anything that puts you in touch with people that don't just think the same way that you are, with whom you can discover the unity of familiarity, right? People that you actually learn to trust and they learn to trust you and you discover that you have something to teach them, which means that they probably have something to teach you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Any last comment? Dawn. Oh boy. Just kidding.
Well, you mentioned patience a couple times at least. And so Nathan's question made me wonder, like, what's the role of patience in the church's role right now? Like, I want to do something active. Wouldn't it be great if we changed the world? But we are in the season of Advent. I just wonder what you think patience looks like right now for the church.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. And I think that, what?
Thanks.
Yeah. I think that I just don't have a very exciting answer to it because I think it just is doing the hard work of living together and leaving your house and as much as you're able to and coming to things like this, right? And going to worship and discover again and again that it's the patience, I think it is the patience of learning, right? Over years, a church community really is formed into something that it wouldn't have been had it not said all of those particular prayers, heard all of those particular sermons, heard the Bible that many particular times, right? So I think part of the patience is, like, really the patience operates out of trust that something real is happening, and that real thing that's happening is for the sake of the world around us, not for some sort of little private club that we get to enjoy one another and look at each other building such a wonderful community, right? But actually make a difference, right? I take Rowan Williams to be absolutely serious when he says that these kinds of communities are probably the most significant preservative for law-governed democracy in contemporary societies. He's not just waxing poetic. He really thinks communities like this are what will preserve Western liberal democracies. So if you care about those, I think part of the patience is trusting that you will see the effect of it, right, around you.
It's probably in that context encouraging, which it often isn't, to realize how disparate we are right here in our own political views and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So here we are.
That's right. That's right. Yep. Yeah, as I said at the outset, I wanted to offer these remarks as a way of acknowledging something that I think we do see in this church community, and I know that we've seen in communities like it around our city. But I think you're absolutely right that it is encouraging and really powerful. Yeah. Well, it's 20 to 9. You all have my email addresses. I think that we should leave it there, and I thank you all again for coming. I want to just encourage you, if you're looking for another place to re-engage with this community, next Saturday we're having an Advent Vigil with musicians and silence, marked by musicians and silence. So if you're looking for a place to practice the patience that Dawn was just asking about, this might be a particularly good moment to be able to do that. Graham has made some tea, which is at the back. You're welcome to stay as long as you please. Thank you.